First, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that we are actually recording tonight's session. So please, if you would rather your face not be seen at all in the context of this meeting, just turn your camera off. Otherwise, we're recording this tonight because we've had a huge amount of interest in this event, and we want to make sure that people have both the opportunity to join us tonight, but also potentially go back and watch this event at their own leisure. So I'm excited to actually be joining you this evening from the Ngunnawal and Ngambri country down in Canberra. Parliament is sitting at the moment, so I'm here for this week and next week. And I'd like to start tonight by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from, to their elders past and present. We're going to have a really important discussion, which has already started in our community this year, and will possibly peak at the end of this year with our referendum coming up. So it's a really important time for us all to be considering what role we believe our First Nations people play and how we want to move forward as a nation. So it's a real privilege for me to be a parliamentarian at this point in time. I'd like to start by welcoming the incredible guests tonight. So we have two fantastic speakers, Alexia Wellbeloved and Stephen Wright. Just giving you a little bit of background on our speakers. So Alexia is the campaign manager for fisheries and threatened species at the Australian Marine Conservation Society. So she's the campaign manager. She's passionate about conservation of the world's wildlife and the welfare of animals. Her goal is to leave the world in a better and fairer state than when she arrived. Sounds like a soulmate to me. She spends her time working on the development of environmental policies, campaigning to promote conservation and animal welfare, and lobbying to ensure appropriate legislation to protect our environment. Joining her tonight, we have the very clever Stephen Wright, who is the Director of Energy and Climate Change at the Business Council of Australia. Stephen is an economist and a public policy advisor with over 25 years experience working in industry and government. He has a strong background in energy and climate policy and is a senior economist in several capacities, including for the Victorian government. Stephen has also been an advisor in the climate change and energy space for a number of different organisations over a number of years. So it's fantastic to have both Alexia and Stephen with us tonight. Hopefully most of the people logged in tonight would realise that what we're starting tonight is an extension of the work that we did in the 12 months leading up to the election, which was a series of community conversations on topics that we know are important to everyone who resides in North Sydney. I think it was definitely made very clear to me very early on when I announced my candidacy as an independent candidate for North Sydney that there was a high degree of interest in the Samuels Review around the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act, and how whichever incoming government came in would be held to account for the decisions that they would make and the courses they would take. This week in the House, we have the Nature Repair Market Bill, which has literally, the debate around that has started this evening. So I've come back from the House having seconded a motion from Zoe Daniels to focus on getting the EPA up before we actually go with this act. But for us here tonight, what we're actually going to focus on is the background, what's been happening in this long-awaited environmental law reforms. We're going to look at the present situation. So what is the Nature Repair Bill, which is currently before the Parliament? And then we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about the future. What next steps do we need to take to ensure Australia's nature is properly protected? We have allowed time at the end of this session for Q&As. So Carly from my team is moderating our chat tonight. Please, if you have questions as we go through, pop them in the chat, and then we'll open up for more formal questions when both of our speakers have finished speaking. So we're going to start with Alexia tonight. And Alexia is going to take us through the reforms and how the Nature Repair Bill actually fits within those reforms. She's going to provide us with some background framing and context to the environmental law and how the Nature Repair Bill actually fits in with all of that. So over to you, Alexia.
Thank you very much. And just while I share my screen, I just thank you for that lovely introduction. And I just like to acknowledge the Gamaragal people for where I live and work from, and I think many of you are probably from as well, and the lands on which I'm on. And I guess as Kylie said, I do want to talk to you about the background and set a bit of that context. And really it's in the frame of 2023 being the year for reform. This is potentially a once in a generation opportunity. We look forward to being part of these conversations going forward about making the most of this year, because it's really vital we do so. Just some basic stuff up on this slide. Hopefully you can see this as a slideshow, which I'll do now. So the Environment Protection and Conservation and Biodiversity Conservation Act, with the EPBC Act, as I'll be calling it throughout the night. This came into force in 1999. It's the federal environmental legislation that sets the legal framework for environmental protection across Australia. So it really sets the context for how our unique and amazing environment in Australia needs to be protected. As part of that legislation, it sets out that every 10 years, the legislation must be reviewed. So the first review happened in 2009, and I started working on the EPBC Act around or just before that time. And that was done by Alan Hawke. And then most recently, the second 10-year review, or the 20-year review, was undertaken by Professor Graham Samuel, and his report was released at the end of 2020. Now, I have to say there's not a huge number of positive things that were included in that report. I've just pulled out some of the words that were used in his report, or some of the phrases used in his report when he concluded, and I'll read out some of those now. Professor Samuel found that the EPBC Act was outdated, it was ineffective, it required fundamental reform, it was a barrier to holistic environmental management, it should deliver better outcomes for the environment, and that the environmental trajectory is currently unsustainable. I think we can all agree that's pretty damning things, and really quite, I found them fairly depressing things, given that this is meant to be our premier piece of legislation that's actually meant to be protecting our environment. It's just not good enough at the moment. So I think that's something that we've all known, and every 5 years the State of the Environment report comes out, and it successively got worse each year. The most recent report, which I think officially was the 2021 report, was released in July last year. And that found that there was widespread and rapid decline, which are pushing ecosystems to the brink of collapse. And that there are also high rates of species decline. Australia is unfortunately now an extinction hotspot, particularly for mammals. And I don't think that's a record of which anyone is proud. And so it's clear from the State of the Environment report and the Samuel review that reforms of our legislation are long overdue. The first review in 2009 called for reforms of the Act to be undertaken, and that never happened. The Samuel review in 2020 has also said that. And I helped set up in 2013 an alliance called the Places You Love Alliance, which is now an alliance of more than 70 organisations, from local, volunteer, species-specific groups up to national and international bodies, such as ourselves, the Australian Marine Conservation Society, WWF, ACF, the Wilderness Society, BirdLife, and many, many more. And since 2013, we've been working on these issues, trying to better protect our environment. But for the past probably, 7 or 8 years, been calling on the respective governments to strengthen our environmental laws, because they're simply not strong enough. So we were very pleased when the ALP government put in place some commitments to actually reform the EPBC Act. And in December last year, they published what they call their Nature Positive Plan. And you'll see this nature positive term used a lot now. It's the government's new frame about what they want the reforms, the driver for the reforms. They want the reforms to be nature positive. And we're waiting to see a full definition of this. And there's lots of international definitions out there. But, we see it as no regression. We need to see positive outcomes and actually see those outcomes delivered for our environment. In this report, it says, almost in these words, that the EPBC Act is not working for environment, business, or the community. And I think we can all agree that if a piece of legislation isn't working for anyone, and it's the environmental legislation that's meant to be setting these environmental outcomes, we need to do something, and we need to do it urgently. So what has been set out in this plan is that there'll be a new package of environmental legislation. Our understanding of that at the moment, and it's still in development, is that the EPBC Act will be rewritten. Some of the commitments included in the Nature Positive Plan are the development of national environmental standards. Now, that is to us a fundamental building brick of these reforms. One main criticism of the EPBC Act at the moment is it's very process-based. It's focused on needing to do 10-year reviews, needing to publish certain notifications in newspapers, and things have moved on. It's 20 years ago, and even though we knew a lot about the environment 20 years ago, we know even more now, and we can do better with our legislation. So rather than focusing on process on how we protect the environment, we need to look at we need to think about what environmental outcomes we actually want to achieve in our legislation, and we need to set these down and probably legislate for what those outcomes need to be. And at the moment, the EPBC doesn't do that, but if we have this fundamental new approach as part of this framework of national environmental standards, we think that that could go a long way if they're appropriately ambitious. The other really important commitment that's been made as part of this Nature Positive Plan is the establishment of a new independent, very important word, National Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. It's been, as of the budget recently, it's now called Environment Protection Australia. And this is sort of colloquially being called the tough cop on the beat. It's the new body that will be established to ensure compliance and enforcement with these hopefully stronger new national environment laws. And that's really important, because if we are setting outcomes, we need to make sure that these outcomes are being adhered to and actually delivering on the things that we're trying to deliver on. So we need to have this independent body that is monitoring performance to make sure we're hitting those outcomes. Another really important new commitment is the development of the establishment of a new data division within the Federal Environment Department. This is going to be called the Environment Information Australia. This is a really important body because we need more real-time interrogatable data for all users of the environment to know where our unique wildlife and their habitats are. If we don't know that, if there's no way of finding out there's more excuses to lose it and to not protect it properly and avoid it, or else actually identify where those areas we want to protect it are. To do this, we need significantly more funding, though. And so one of the mechanisms within this Nature Positive Plan to provide some funding is the establishment of a nature repair market. And this bill that's in the House this week is one element that's included. And what that is purporting to do is to actually give a mechanism for private investment in the environment. And at this point, I might hand back to you, Kylie. I guess what I'd say, this is one mechanism and one element of the plan, but there's many others in that Nature Positive Plan that I haven't covered yet.
And I guess, Alexia, that thank you for throwing back to me, because one of the things that really strikes me is that from the Samuels review, I believe there were 38 recommendations, and the Nature Repair Bill is based on one of those recommendations. I don't know what number it is, but can we just spend a minute then? I mean, what's your opinion on the government starting with the Nature Repair Bill?
Well, it's a really good, question, really. I mean, obviously, it's really important, and we support the development and implementation of ways you can meaningful efforts to actually repair nature. But we're really concerned that the introduction of a nature repair market bill prior to the introduction of a reformed new act is a bit premature because it risks locking in a market mechanism that isn't aligned to these new national environmental standards, which are yet to be fully drafted, and we haven't seen those yet. So we're just a bit concerned that that part of the huge package of reforms that's contained in the Nature Positive Plan is racing ahead before the sort of fundamental other parts have caught up. Now, I think, we do know, and we totally agree and support the principle of protecting nature and getting that significant investment from governments, which can be supported by private sector investment through the creation of market mechanisms. However, the use of market-based mechanisms to stimulate private investment in nature repair, which is what this bill is all about and this market's all about, needs to be a complementary mechanism to strong federal and state regulation and integrated planning, and we don't know what that system fully is yet. So as it's currently drafted, we're really concerned that it actually won't deliver nature positive outcomes or build the investment that it needs to protect and restore the environment. And that restoration point is really important. Because any investments in nature need to support the delivery of a science-based national and regional conservation priorities. And at the moment, the bill does not include the environmental objectives that the market needs to deliver. And therefore, that risks a lack of clarity and accountability on what the market will actually achieve, and fundamentally doesn't align with what the science says we need to do to reach our targets, such as protecting 30% of our land and marine habitats by 2030. So what we are calling on is to make sure that an overarching restoration strategy to guide private investment in nature restoration is needed before we have this bill. There's also a couple of extra points, if I may, just add that are sort of our concerns around this bill. I mean, I think for the framework to actually be successful and to deliver these nature positive outcomes, we need to make sure that the nature repair market bill and the government rules out linking this market mechanism to biodiversity offset schemes, because by their very nature, they're trying to deliver two very different outcomes, and linking the two risks the scheme becoming a greenwashing front, and potentially the growth of this new market resulting in more destruction of nature than actually protecting it, and therefore not delivering the repair that the bill is promising. The other thing that we're quite concerned about is, at the moment, the proposed regulator for the bill is the Clean Energy Regulator, and we don't feel that that has the expertise to regulate a nature-based market. And with the commitment to create the new national EPA, that is a regulator that is intended to get that integrity, transparency, and accountability into the system. So that is the appropriate regulator. But because we don't have that yet, this bill cannot say that it will have a regulator that doesn't actually exist in any form of way. So this is another example of the nature repair bill kind of going too far ahead of the broader framework. So I guess in summary, what we'd really like to see at the moment is the focus on creating the foundational legal framework and instruments that need to work to protect and restore nature as a whole, and get the new EPBC Act, whatever it may be called, the EPA, the data division, all the other elements that are beyond what I've mentioned tonight of the Nature Positive Plan, including like the conservation planning efforts established, and then considering the nature repair market to help support all those objectives that are set out in the new legislation, which we don't know yet. It's really important to us that with these reforms, as I said earlier, this is a once in a generation opportunity in 2023. The EPBC Act shows us we only get these best every 20 years, and a lot can happen to our unique environment in the next 20 years with climate change and many other impacts on it. So we need to not rush this. We need to take the time. Let's get it right. Let's get the full framework in place. And then let's have a market mechanism in place to help get additional funding for our nature.
Thanks, Alexia. I think it's really interesting for me to be here as North Sydney's rep, because what you've just said and how you've summarised it is so true. There is so much work to be done. And when you look at the Samuels Review, you look at the Chubb Review, you look at, the Nature Positive Response Plan, what I've kind of been really trying to wrap my head around is why start here? Like, why is this really one of the first significant steps that the government has chosen to take? And, I guess from my perspective, one of the things that I also know we're all very agreed upon is that no one sector can fix what we're currently facing. We are facing into an environment where needs must. The government must lead, the community must come on board and collaborate, and we do need business to really lean into this and get involved as well, so we can move forward in the bigger picture. So, Stephen, I actually want to come to you now, and again, thank you for your time. With your economist hat on and your Business Council of Australia hat on, why do you think, I'm going to ask you two questions. One's what you were expecting, the other one is without notice. So the first one is, why do you think the repair market could work? But the second one is, why do you think do you have a reason for why the government has started here? Do you have any thinking on why they might have chosen this piece of legislation first?
Okay, look, great questions, and I'll certainly give you a big business sort of an economics framing. Before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and for me, that's the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And secondly, just Kylie, thank you so much for having the BCA tonight. I just want to thank you for that. Straight into your questions. So the BCA represent 130, 140 of Australia's biggest corporations. And by way of context, our members have been involved in the Samuel Review right since 2019 when it first began. And they've been intimately involved in that process, which is still going. And more recently, as Alexia said, it's broadened out into the nature positive plan. So the government's now extending it with things like the nature repair bill and other elements. And in a nutshell, I can speak for our membership, and we are miners, we are the banks, we are the supermarkets, the digital companies, it's all the big companies, the household names, and many of our members are global corporations. But either way, they're big employers, they're big taxpayers, and they've got a lot at stake in the environmental laws in Australia. So I say that, and then I'll tell you the broad position of our membership is that to be successful, the government's nature positive plan needs to be about reforming all of our environmental laws so that they actually improve the physical and natural outcomes. That's the first thing. Second thing is these laws have to balance with that Australia's economic development. And the third thing is the laws have to balance including First Nations people in that decision making. And as Alexia alluded to, or actually said, we're not hitting the mark on any of those three things. And our membership are fully aware of that. And just to take a global context, because this is how business think about, even though this is domestic policy, Kylie, we're talking about, our members take a global context because some of them have multiple operations in multiple parts of the world, but all of our members sell their products not just to Australia, but to consumers overseas. And they also get their finance, their loan, their debts and equities. They get that locally from Australia, but they get a lot of that from overseas. So our members have stakeholders all over the world, so they take a global perspective. The World Economic Forum, with respect to biodiversity, has sort of said three really big things. One is that human activity is eroding the world's ecology. More than 1 million species are at risk of extinction. More than 1/3 of topsoil is already degraded. Half of the world's coral reefs are damaged. And we're having the most destructive forest fires globally that we've had for more than 10,000 years. That's the first point. Second point is, and this is kind of the economics business point, more than half the world's GDP, gross domestic product, is medium to heavily dependent on biodiversity and nature services. So nature provides services to our industries to make goods and services. More than half of that economic value is, if you like, tied up or interdependent with nature. The third point is, to the investment point, to halt biodiversity degradation globally right now, the World Economic Forum estimating that we need about $900 billion a year, every year, invested in restoring and repairing, regenerating nature. That's what we need every year. What we got in 2019 was 1/6 of that, 150 billion. So we're way off the mark in private investment in money flowing to repair the physical environment so that our world economy can continue to produce the goods and services that everybody wants. In late last year, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was set up. It's a bit like the parallel to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is about reducing carbon emissions. This agreement is about restoring biodiversity. That agreement, 196 countries signed it. They set a 30% sort of restoration target for 30%. By 2030, 30% of oceans and land will be restored under this agreement. Australia was leading in that process. Australia is considered one of 17 mega diverse countries in the world, and Australia was actually leading in bringing together that negotiation and that global biodiversity framework. And of course, Australia has its own 30 by 30 target to map onto that global framework. So our business members look at it from that perspective. And so to bring it all, Kylie, to bring it all now to this nature repair bill, we've got an international biodiversity framework. And so the way economists think about it, and I think the way a lot of industry leaders think about it, is that they are aware that the ecosystem provides services like biodiversity, like carbon sinks. Nature provides services to our economy just like iron ore and steel and the products we make. And all these services are valuable. And the problem is, apologies for the jargon, but the problem is a lot of these services in the ecosystem are not valued in markets. They're not priced in. And so, for example, if you build a big development project and you degrade some land, the cost of that land is not priced into the products you sell. Equally, if you're a corporate and you invest in restoring land, it's very hard for you, the corporate, to demonstrate. There's no market for you to go and say, look what I did and here's the value. It's not easy to do. So our markets are failing, and our members are fully aware of this. And this goes to the heart of the bill. This is why I think the bill could work, and this is why I think the bill's a good idea in theory, notwithstanding the challenges and the other things Alexia said, which I agree with, most of which. But the heart of the bill is this: if designed well, this bill will enable private investors to start to have a price signal and start to incorporate some of those externalities into markets. And when that happens, then businesses and consumers and banks and other stakeholders can start to react to the value of biodiversity ecosystems. At the moment, that stuff's undervalued. And that's why I think this bill, it's only a first step, and all laws are just theoretical foundations. But, our members believe that the bill is the right first step. It doesn't go far enough, but it does lay the foundation to start to price in these ecosystem goods that we need. So if I can put it that way, our members, corporations all over the world, are getting pressure from capital markets, from consumer markets, demanding that they put nature on their balance sheets. They cannot put nature on their balance sheets if they can't measure it, and if they can't create assets out of the things that they invest in, then they can't put them on their balance sheet. So this is a way of bringing nature into the sort of economy's balance sheet. And so we think this bill, as a first step, does that. There's an estimate out there that says in Australia, there's about $140 billion potentially that could be drawn into the nature repair market, potentially, if these laws are designed correctly. This bill's the first step. So this could be a big market, but of course, the actual demand for these biodiversity credits that will come out of this nature repair law remains to be seen. And it really does depend on some of the things Alexia was alluding to. Firstly, is the framework watertight and does it work? But secondly, and I think even more importantly, how does this bill fit in the context of the EPBC reforms and some of the other state-based things, the new EPA, regional plans, all those things coming together? How does this bill fit? And our members are asking government for more clarity on that. We like what we see in the bill, but I guess we don't like the fact that there's a lack of clarity about how all these things hang together. And to Alexia's point, and yours too, Kylea, I think the timing of this from a policy design point of view is not ideal. they're running a few things in parallel. If you started again, you probably wouldn't do it this way. And so there's not enough clarity about how these policy elements connect together. And so that, if you like, that's a criticism, but we do think that the bill itself is not the problem. It's the lack of clarity of how it connects into the other pieces. And it's certainly a good starting point. I can sort of leave it there. I think that's enough for the moment.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic perspective, Stephen. Actually, what I just heard you say, you said it on a couple of occasions, and actually a couple of the concerns that Alexia raised, you would agree with. You agree that in an ideal world, we potentially wouldn't be starting with this piece of legislation. But the point I take from what you've just said is that there is a potential market there that is yet to be tested. And if this bill is done well, then for everybody's, in a broader context, one of the things I've never really understood, and I've had this conversation with a number of people now, our local councils on their balance sheet have a line which is called grey assets. And that grey asset line is all about pavements and gutters and roads, and they value them. So when one is wrecked for whatever reason, they can fine people for having destroyed it, or they're able to actually insure for it. But councils don't have their green assets on their balance sheet. So as a consequence, when somebody destroys a tree, their fine is like $3,000 or something, whereas I'm sure everybody on this call would immediately say the value of a tree, if it's 100 years old, is probably closer to $80,000. Why wouldn't somebody be fined in that way? So my business brain is attracted to this as a way of pulling, if I come back to that premise that I said, that we're going to have to find a way for government, community and business to all work together. And we know with business, it's triple bottom line reporting. Yeah, it's purpose, people and place. So I can see how that works. I want to ask, Steve, is there anywhere in the world that's doing this well? Are there other countries or markets, on your point that there's, this is a global challenge? Is there anywhere that you think?
Well, the World Economic Forum give a couple of case studies where biodiversity markets are operating, but they're small scale. They're nothing like carbon markets at the moment. And so this framework, this biodiversity, this global framework is following on the heels of the carbon framework, which is much more advanced. But I think the biodiversity one is catching up at a rapid rate. So no, we don't have any large scale markets yet. And the thing for investors, as you'd appreciate, Kylea, is if you're a big firm and, we need billions of dollars to fix the environment, and governments can't afford to do that. If we're going to get the global capital markets and companies to invest in this, they need frameworks that are deep and liquid and durable. If they're going to put their money down, which they say they want to, and some of their shareholders are pressuring them to do, and their consumers are pressuring, what they need is investment certainty. And so we need these deep, long, durable market frameworks so that can happen. And we don't have those yet, but it is encouraging that you've got an international sustainability standards board, which is a voluntary process that is putting together, if you like, a whole lot of sustainability metrics to set up an international baseline for nature. And that's not law, it's an international collaboration, but lots of different countries are looking at this international baseline and then going to their local jurisdiction, Australia, or if you're in Canada or Europe, wherever, and saying, now, what can we do to our local climate disclosure laws, nature disclosure laws, and other things so that we can start to develop these markets at scale? We know it's nascent at the moment. There are some examples, as I said, there are people buying credits and creating them for sure, but it's nowhere near at the scale that's required to deal with 30% to begin with of oceans and land globally. So we do, I am looking at this globally because Australia is an important part of it, but of course, money goes all over the world to do all kinds of things. We take a global perspective.
So on that, Stephen, can I just ask, I know one of the things that concerns me personally, and I think, some that I've spoken to about this legislation, is the potential for this nature repair market to essentially become a quasi carbon credit system. Like I'm going to invest in this because actually over here I am building this and destroying this.
Yes.
How do you see this mechanism? Because my understanding is that that's not what this mechanism is meant to be about. I mean, this mechanism is meant to be about attracting that new money, that new development, creating
Yes.
space without reason, other than
Yes.
I mean, what's your comment to that concern and criticism?
Well, the first thing I would say to that is that this biodiversity credits market is distinct from the EPBC Act and indeed the offsets arrangements at the moment. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be connected in the future. But see, I feel some people challenge me and say, oh, well, this is rubbish, throw it out. I'm thinking, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because if you put in a good framework that's got integrity, in other words, you can actually measure biodiversity. So let's assume someone does come along and want to improve the environment for philanthropic reasons or other reasons. At least if they do it, it's a measurable outcome, and you've created a financial asset of credit that someone else could buy and use. Now, some people might say, well, that's not going to happen. The private sector would never do that. But if you don't have the framework in place, you'll never be able to test out the true appetite for this. And I would say, having conversations with our members and CEOs and boards, there might be more pressure than some people think for private companies to do this, even if they wouldn't ordinarily do it. There's a lot of pressure, and it's going to build. And as that pressure to invest in the environment gets bigger and bigger, if corporates don't have a proper framework, an investable framework where they can put their money, it's going to be that much harder. So what I'm saying is, lay this foundation properly. It's not the end game, but it's certainly it's a piece of the puzzle that needs to be there. Do it well, and then let's build on that. And if we have to connect the EPBC to it, of course we need to do that. But there's no clarity of what the government's thinking there, and that's one of the criticisms we would say to governments. Well, what are you thinking? Is the government going to be a buyer of these credits? Are offsets? Can you make EPB offsets under the nature repair bill? It's not clear on that yet. They call them credits for a reason. So there's all these questions to be answered, and our members want those questions answered so we can see how this is going to work together. But it's really not. We're not pretending this bill in itself is going to solve anything. But gosh, if you don't have a way to value things, it's very hard to get an investor to put money up. I think anybody who's in business would understand that.
Alexia, can I bring you back in here, because I actually think that's a really that's a great segue back to more of the movement. I can see there's lots in the chat about, in some instances, the concern that, there has to be value on something for it to be investable. And does that actually signal a fundamental flaw in our society? Like, we should be doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because we can potentially make money from it or wipe away a sin. Alexia, what would you, having listened to what Stephen's just shared with us, what's your key takeout about what we've just heard from him in the frame of the conservation space?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that we obviously agree on. I think the major thing is, and I think I saw, some of the chat around this, and, Stephen's talking about the need to get a, good framework out, but this is meant to be one element of a much broader reform. Yeah. And really, the way it has been framed in the Nature Positive Plan is a fundamental rethink and some people calling it like a 180-degree change in the way that we are actually seeking to protect and get those outcomes from, through new legislation. And by driving one element of the plan before we really understand what the rest of the plan is trying to do, like effectively, we don't know what our objectives are. I mean, like clearly we do, but these aren't set out in legislation yet, but we're trying to give one part of it without actually having, knowing what our outcomes are. We don't have that overarching, effectively legislative framework or strategy or whatever you want to use. So, personally, I feel that there's inherent value in all nature. But obviously, you do need, one thing, as I said in my presentation, the environment is woefully underfunded by tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Really, we need significant investment. And I can see Stephen nodding his head. And, the use of market-based mechanisms to protect nature is an important element, but it needs to be complementary, and it needs to be not seen by government, which is my concern and that of many of my colleagues in other organisations, that the governments are using this as the sole approach rather than part of a bigger picture. Like clearly there are lots of elements funded already, but that the scale of that needs to be significantly increased. So really we want to see this as a smaller element, not a driving force. And by the way this is being sequenced in the reforms, it suggests it's more of a driving force. And I think that does present us with significant concerns, because we can't see what that broader framework and strategy is. Like clearly we know what we want, but until it gets through Parliament, then we can't be assured of that. So, and until it's drafted, actually put on paper, which we just don't have right now. But we know we need a lot stronger framework than the EPBC Act, and effectively this bill is being done within the frame of the EPBC Act, which, as Stephen and I both said, is not working for anyone. The reviews have shown that, the State of the Environment report have shown that. Those of us who've been working on it knows that it needs significant strengthening. So, as I said at the end, this is an important element of the reform. So we need to take time. Let's not rush it, because if we rush one element, the rest of it isn't necessarily all going to fit together in the way in which a good, strong, solid package that we desperately need for the environment would do. So it just seems a bit of a out of step to what we expect when you do a nice package of reforms. A package is a package in our view, not pulling certain parts out.
Stephen, would you like to comment to that?
Well, just to say that I agree, actually. I mean, I'm trying to think, put my head in the government's shoes and sort of say, well, why have they done this now so quickly? And I guess, I don't know what the minister would say, but it probably, as I sort of said before, biodiversity was bubbling along with carbon. I think it was 2015 at the COP, but it didn't have the prominence or the speed then that climate change did, as distinct from just biodiversity. And I don't know if, but governments were all signing on to it and it was moving along, but it's come to the fore very quickly in recent years. And now we don't have any legislation. We don't have a way of dealing with nature repair, actually. We've got the EPBC, but that absolutely, you want to stop new destruction. And you've got, when a new project comes up, the EPBC Act is supposed to do that. And if we get that act reformed properly, it can do that. But what about all the nature repair that needs to be done that no one's doing anything to? It's just there. So there's a few problems to solve. And I think, yes, perhaps the nature repair bill should have been thought of 5 years ago and should be in place already. Perhaps we should have a market in that, but we don't. So it isn't ideal. I agree with 100% with that. But this is where we find ourselves. And from a private sector point of view, as I said before, capital markets and consumers are going to keep demanding this. It's not going to be a question of whether governments force companies to do this. My view is companies, especially listed ones, are going to have to demonstrate to people all over that A, they're not hurting nature, but B, it's nature positive. It's leaving it better off. And they've concrete, rigorous plans to do that. It's not just going to be like I don't want to use the phrase feel good, but it's beyond that. We're getting beyond that. We're not there yet, but my view is that avalanche of demand is building. We're not there, but when it comes, we have to have frameworks in place. So it's not ideal, but we need to get on with it.
I think what I find fascinating about this and what I've struggled with is the fact that so much of this legislation is predicated on the idea of trust us, the rest is coming. And even to the point, one of the conversations we've been having with the minister's team is, you're setting up a framework and a scheme that you're saying in the short term is going to be overseen by the climate energy regulator, but by your own admission, really ideally it should be overseen by the Environmental Protection Agency. So why have you gone here before you've done the work, which should be the National Environmental Standards, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the police on the block, as you described them, Alicia. There's been lots of people in the House, even as the debate has started this afternoon, that have used that phrase, cart before horse. Not only is the cart before the horse, they've actually gone to the market. So, how do we, just to give you kind of context, I think what is interesting for me is in the conversations that are being had down here at the moment, it is very much a little bit to what you've just said, Stephen, in that what they're trying to do is to lay down the context of a framework, because they are convinced the market will take up to 24 months to get going. So by their logic and their argument, they're saying we've got time to get the Environmental Protection Agency in place. We've got time to get the national environmental standards set. But if we don't send a clear signal to both the Australian domestic market and the international market that we are going to be in this game, the risk is people aren't going to invest here. They're going to invest elsewhere.
That's right. I agree.
And so I think that's where I've been kind of trying to follow the conversation down here on the basis, which is, do I think this legislation is good enough? No, I don't. Do I think it could be better? Absolutely. Are there fundamentally some flaws in it in terms of it's being birthed outside the context of everything that needs to exist to support it? Yes, it has. But if I follow the government's logic through on the reason they're doing it is to send that signal to try and lock in, create that 140, I think you used the number, the $140 billion market. Was it here in Australia, or was that you, Alexia?
The one estimate is roughly that, yeah.
Yeah, about 140.
The potential, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We've got to lock it in and attract it into, our Australian marketplace, and not actually watch companies. Because to your point, Stephen, and Alexia, I don't know whether you'd agree, I actually and agree with many of the people who have passed comment on the chat tonight. We are very rapidly moving into the space and place where businesses will have to do this, not just because it's good for their bottom line. I mean, it is a moral, requirement, and shareholders are holding businesses to account that aren't behaving in this way well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say, obviously, I can't speak for business, but I think, what is interesting about this process and why this, is such an amazing opportunity. And, I don't use the once in a generation tagline lightly, but, we've been talking lots to BCA and other groups, and, largely we are agreed. We need to reform this. There is a lot of agreement there. There's obviously some fundamental areas where we don't agree. But that's not unexpected. But I think, the missing piece for me is, and I don't think I covered this in my talk, but in the Nature Positive Plan, there was a commitment to the timeframe of draft legislation by mid-year, with the new legislation to be introduced by the end of this calendar year. At this stage, the reforms are going slower than that. And what we're really concerned is that there's a real lack of urgency. So, all of those points you just made, so well, Kylie, around that, it takes 24 months to set up. At this stage, we are concerned that those reforms are going too slowly. And so I guess what we'd really like to see is the community, letting the government know that this is urgent. We can't afford to wait another year, 2 years, 10 years if we miss this opportunity to reform these laws. Yes, it's great to be getting on with one part of it for some, but for us it's the wrong thing to be pushing. We need to be actually getting, if we, parliamentary time is not easy to get, and I think we would like to see that time devoted to that, the more fundamental parts of the package, rather than the parts that that are perhaps a bit too soon and don't have the full understanding behind them. So it's that urgency, and that's something that we're doing. We've got a new campaign called If You Love It, Help Save It, that all the Places You Love groups are doing to try and drive that community response. So I'd encourage you to have a look for that, and let the government know that this is a really urgent thing. I think, there's so many people out in the community that care deeply, including myself, about our environment, our land, our amazing waters. There's so many unique species. So we need to use this opportunity now to get that broader reform and make sure we don't lose it, because it's not guaranteed at this stage. And I guess that's the fundamental point that concerns us, that we might get this one little bit of reform and then we'll miss our window for the rest. And we don't want this to be the whole package.
That you've just summed up beautifully my concern as well, Alexia. I think, what I've seen with this government in the climate space to date even is there is a tendency to grab a good headline but leave a lot of the detail lacking underneath. And that's why, you know, I can tell everyone on this call at the moment, there are some really robust conversations going on in this house at the moment, you know, the minister and her staff, and they are being very open to conversation, I've got to say. It's really, it's a very positive experience working with them. One of the questions has come in, I'm going to throw it to you both because I think it sums up a lot of the comments that are coming up. And this is the question. Do you think this will drive investment in biodiversity restoration and conservation? Or do you think it will go into regional development for parklands, green buildings and agriculture where there are perceived biodiversity services for business? Who wants to go first? Do you think it'll drive the market, Steve?
Well, as I said before, it remains to be seen how big the appetite is and how quick it'll be. But I think you want to set this thing up so that, if there are shareholders out there who are genuinely want to make the biggest impact on biodiversity, this framework allows them to go and get a method off the shelf from the Clean Energy Regulator or the EPA and say, and this is the best bang for buck. So you want this framework to flush out the best biodiversity opportunities. If it's done well, it should be able to do that. And therefore, you're getting whomever the investor is and whatever the demand curve is, it goes into the places where it can add the most value. And that's up to how good the framework's designed as to whether or not that's possible. So I don't know where the money would go to the question, but you want this framework to reflect the biodiversity value. If it's high in one area, you want the money flowing there first. That's a good, efficient framework.
Yeah, and I guess I'd say that a lot of the we are concerned that the bill's being fast-tracked because of projected demand, because that's all they can base it on, right? Not real demand. So, we need to, I guess, until the market is established, you don't know whether that demand is actually there and where it will go. So, it is a new test case. And if it works, like absolutely, we need to have those market mechanisms as part of a broader package. But I think a lot of those questions are to be determined. So I think I don't feel that I can say anything with confidence. But that's exactly why you need the framework. And I feel like I'm a broken record behind it to set out what the objectives are and what you're trying to achieve and making sure you're not including offsets and things like that. So it doesn't become a greenwashing scheme. I don't think anyone wants this. I can see Stephen nodding furiously to be that. So if you don't have that fundamental objectives and that strategy, because we want this is meant to be a restoration, right? It's a repair. It's not just to sort of, stop things. We actually want to see that restoration. That for us, that's an essential element of these reforms. We can't just keep it stopping the rot. We need to actually repair and restore. Right. And repair and restore, it requires a step change in the way we act. And if this can deliver that, then absolutely I support it, but it's part of that bigger package. Yep. With lots of safeguards.
Fantastic. I think you've just said it beautifully, Alexia. In the interest of promptness, we have 2 minutes left within this chat. So I'm going to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us tonight on the call. I can see there has been a flurry of questions that if everyone is comfortable what we've done, we'll take a record of these questions. We'll actually share them back with Alexia and Steve and see if either of them would like to comment to those questions, so we can then share it through either my weekly e-newsletter that goes out on a Friday or at the next chat that we have around this reform. We can table those answers back. I think if I was to sum up what I've heard tonight, it is that there is a really big picture that we need to be prepared to tackle as this 47th Parliament. And that really big picture is a fundamental step change in the way that nature has been managed in this country. It's not just about stopping further destruction. It is about restoring and repairing what has already been lost. And that as a Parliament, it is really important that we hold this government to account to be making sure that the measures that they introduce are such that they are complementary and they are solid and they actually deliver the outcomes and the results that we want to see. So I feel like I've so appreciated Stephen and Alexia, your time tonight. I actually will have, I think, the opportunity to speak to this bill as a part of the second reading debate tomorrow, and will be signalling to the government that we'll be pursuing some amendments to the legislation that relate to transparency around how decisions are made and how the biodiversity credits are awarded, how they're used, how they age, those sort of things, to really pull in detail into it. But I want to thank you both so much for your time. Thank everyone that's joined us tonight. And just to, I guess, continue to reiterate to everyone on this call, you know, we've decided to try and do politics differently in North Sydney for this term. And that only works when we actually do pull together in conversations like this. And just thank you for your time tonight. And please watch out for this space, because this, to both Alexia and Stephen, you know, have made the point. This is not just a conversation for one night. These reforms are going to be pressing and present for the next 18 months of this government. And that is the opportunity we have, is to hold this government to account, to delivering them in this term in a way that protects them, regardless of what happens at the next election. And I guess, as someone not tied to a party, that's what I'm concerned about, is that at what point do we lose the major parties because they start campaigning for the next election? I want to get as much done as we can possibly get done in this term, and that's going to require us all to hold this government in this moment to account, to do as much as they possibly can. So thank you so much, everyone, and a special thank you to Alexia and Steve. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Feel free to use your emojis, and we'll look out for the recording of this, which will go up on our website in the next sort of 24 hours if you want to share with friends and family. And as always, please feel free to send any other questions or thoughts through to me at the electoral office, or share through any of our channels. It's been a real privilege speaking with everyone tonight. So take care.
Thank you for having me, Kylea.
Thank you.